Hi, everybody. This talk picks up from the one that I gave at last year's annual meeting, where I talked about my experiential watercolor maps that accentuate sharp, unexpected contrasts in the natural world, especially dramatic climatic gradients on volcanic islands. To me, these contrasts seem to compress natural patterns that we usually associate with entire continents down to human scale. And this gives me the empowering feeling of having the entire world at my fingertips. In watercolor, I compress and sharpen these contrasts even further by fragmenting them into multiple landscape and aerial perspectives. And so these works focus on the edges and spatial relationships between scenes rather than on the scenes themselves. And I enjoy this cartographic and analytical process of drawing the map much more than I do the more artistic process of filling in the pieces. Most of these works lead the viewer along a discrete linear journey from one landscape to the next. This work, for example, is an abstracted representation of this actual journey. And here you can see the sequence of landscapes on that journey across the island. Another way to depict a journey like this is through music, which almost by definition is linear and directional in the sense that it directs the listener along a particular narrative path. Essentially, it's a linear map drawn with sound. So I got it into my head to write a musical depiction of the ascent of an imaginary tropical island. I first wrote it for piano and then for full orchestra. I imagine this musical journey as evoking a linear geographical gradient from desert coastline through rainforest and then to alpine moorland at the summit of the island. And breaking this landscape gradient into its component elements, the idea is that in aggregate, they would reach their maximum intensity, represented here by the more saturated color, around a climax point that I think of as being the tree line. So musical elements would increase in intensity in parallel with these environmental elements. Music is ideal in particular, I think, for representing these compressed multidimensional journeys that I'm so interested in. A musical journey is typically compressed into less time than an actual journey, first of all. Also, the way that music is traditionally structured around discrete themes and phrases, like fragments in my watercolors, breaks the musical landscape down into discrete contrasting experiences. And so I structured the last island around two themes that alternate and overlay. The original overall idea was for desert to be represented by theme A and rainforest to be represented by theme B. But since along this geographical gradient, these landscapes don't actually alternate like that, I had to think about this relationship in a less dogmatic, more complex way. And largely this complexity involved breaking up the geographical gradient with detours, suggesting looking ahead to distant landscapes or imagining or anticipating those distant landscapes. And then selecting particular pieces of that here and there to be evoked by the music. But within those alternating themes, there's still an overall evolution in musical intensity to reflect the overall environmental gradient. So the last island was not based on a painting that I had already painted, but after the fact, I turned it into a video that I illustrated with slides that I cropped from paintings that I had done. And here you can see those slides in the center sized by their duration in the piece. So they're kind of like a deconstructed hypothetical painting that I could have based this piece on. They illustrate the sequence of landscapes that I had in mind when I wrote it. I also divided the piece into chapters based on experiential zones in the environmental narrative, and you can see those listed here across the top. So I will play one clip of theme A, which in the first half of the piece represents the desert. And next, I'll play two clips from the rainforest theme, which I've scored for strings to suggest a softer, lusher landscape than the desert clips, which are generally scored for winds. This first clip represents the rainforest as it's viewed in the distance from the desert coastline. In this next example, the rainforest is imagined in the distance, kind of like a daydream. And because the listener is further along the physical journey, the rainforest is both physically and psychologically closer. And that's represented in the greater intensity of the music. In aligning these musical and geographical journeys, I began thinking about how musical and geographical space relate and align in a broader sense. It was kind of a compulsion to visualize music in a more concrete way than just through sound, analogous to my compulsion to squeeze the world into my field of vision as I do with the watercolors. I've been describing The Last Island as a linear journey, but as you've seen, it does have 2D aspects. It winds between the foreground and distant landscapes, and in some cases along multiple paths that overlap with each other. So what if The Last Island had been based on a journey through a 2D map, like this one that I painted a few years ago, overlaid digitally with the path of travel, rather than a linear sequence of landscapes? You could think of a hypothetical musical journey based on this visual journey as winding along the same path and picking up musical elements in the 2D plane as it goes. And we usually think of music as a temporal medium, but you could consider a geographical journey and a musical journey depicting it as inseparable, in the sense that both travel through time as well as through space. There's a third dimension here too. You could think of this vertical dimension as stacked or layered musical elements like volume, pitch, or instrumental color that play simultaneously and produce an effect in the moment. Whereas the horizontal dimension includes elements like rhythm that need more time to play out. And it's because of this layering that you can have the overlapping paths that I mentioned earlier, where music represents multiple places at once. So I might have been able to map The Last Island in 3D like that if I had had that in mind before I wrote the piece. But the way it turned out, it's still best thought of as a simple linear map that linearizes those two axes in the 2D plane into this arrow at the bottom of the sheet, which represents variation in space. And that curvy red path in the 2D plane becomes this red arrow at the top of the screen that represents variation in time. And music and geography are, in both cases, inseparable. But even going back to the linear conception of The Last Island, I still had the compulsion to better visualize the music in space, to create a visual map of the musical map. I wanted to show more instantaneously how those musical elements vary in intensity over time, how those musical and geographical journeys align. Because even though I composed the piece as a compressed journey, by its very nature as sound, it's less compressed than a painting of that journey would have been, because the piece takes 13 minutes to listen to. A traditional score is technically a map of musical sound already, but it's not easily digestible unless you're adept at reading scores. It's not very illustrative of the music. It's basically a collection of symbols used as instructions by the performer. There are exceptions to this in contemporary music, which are meant to express the character of the music to both the musicians and to a general audience. But for me, this goes in the wrong direction. It's meant to be art in itself. It's painterly. It doesn't break down the experience of the music in any methodical, analytical way, which is what I had the compulsion to do, just like when I'm actually painting, and prefer to think of the process as a mapping process rather than a painting process. So I came up with my own list of musical elements and experimented with different ways of mapping those elements, such as by voice versus by the entire score, over various time intervals and with different legends. And in the top two-thirds of the sheet here, which you can see full size in the map gallery, you can see a selection of those linear maps. My point in making these maps was not to evaluate how well I had done in terms of evoking what I wanted to evoke in the music, but rather to more easily see what I had done. One thing that I think stands out is that the edges between zones in the geographical maps, like between the desert and rainforest, aren't so visible in the musical maps. Everything kind of runs together just because of all the complexity involved. But I think what you can see is that overall, around this climax zone in the black box, those intensities do line up between the different maps. In mapping these musical elements, I felt like I wasn't being very systematic in terms of figuring out the parameters for what exactly I was mapping and how. I sort of tied myself in knots over it. But I landed on grouping them in the same way that geographical elements might be grouped based on how they're measured and mapped. And that's what these three columns in the center represent. So I came up with these three rough types of physical geographical / biogeographical maps. And you can think about these as either 2D maps or more like the 1D transects that are more relevant to aligning with linear musical journeys. So I group the musical elements into these same categories. Some occur in more than one. Also, the time unit, as you can see on the right-hand side, can vary based on the time needed for that element to play out. Again, some elements are more horizontal or vertical in that sense. But I'll go into these four elements that I've highlighted on the left-hand side in detail, which I've chosen to map in these particular ways, which I've also highlighted. One of these is volume or dynamics, which is one element that's measured by level or amount. And this is one of the more straightforward ones. I basically mapped it by the average decibel level per bar in a grayscale. Pitch complexity I mapped as the number of pitch classes per bar. And this is basically a map of the diversity of subtypes within an element. Though to map it legibly, it essentially becomes another grayscale map that's measuring the level or numbers of something. So I mapped this in the orchestra as a whole, similar to dynamics, and that's the thicker band in the center, and also by voice or part, which is the map at the top, where each row represents one voice or part in the orchestra. And this is one case where the vertical dimension comes into play. These rows you can think of as separate maps that are actually layered on top of one another rather than seen from the side, which is how I had to draw it just to make it clear what I was doing. Instrumentation is mapped as a type of distribution map, where each layered map shows where each instrument is playing in the piece. And each instrument is assigned a different color based on its similarity in musical color. And so all instruments in a section, for example, the string section, are all in the same color family, in this case from red to orange, in contrast to, say, the brass family. So finally, relative key. This is also a distribution map, but the different types generally don't overlap with each other. Different keys tend to occur in sequence, and so they can be mapped together on the same map rather than with multiple maps that are layered on top of one another. And I say relative key because it's not about individual keys, but rather changes from one key to the next. So it's essentially a map of key contrast or key variability. And here, each key is represented by a different shade along the color spectrum. So relatively similar keys like C and G major are represented by relatively similar shades. So I'll end with a clip of the climax zone, where the rapid key changes represent not only the intensification of the landscape, but also rapid changes in scenery, physical exertion on the part of the listener, basically climbing in elevation, and also an overall sense of exuberance approaching the tree line and bursting out into the brisk open air. So thank you. If you'd like to hear the entire 13-minute video, please go to the link here, um, and make sure your volume is turned way up at the beginning. On that site, you can also see my watercolor maps and also a blog where I share ideas about edges and journeys in paint, music, and in the real world.